Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I'm your host, Steve Pally. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. Galen, what's the latest?
The latest is we're both wearing backward hats, man. So
Yeah, we're
we're
broing out.
broing out podcast. Yeah, man.
Yeah, no, it's we haven't done enough of this recently. All right, do we have any sports anecdotes or anything like that?
Sports stuff. I mean, British Open, Scotty Scheffler farted during the event and was caught on a hot mic. That's about all I got for you.
Not a big golf guy, but that's hilarious. That's really good. Yeah, summer's a little tough because I like basketball and football. That's
Yeah.
not happening. I don't care so much about baseball. Soccer, I care an increasing amount just because of my son being like utterly and irrevocably obsessed with it. So MLS and that sort of thing. And Premier League. Do you follow that stuff at all?
No, and unfortunately my baseball fandom has I don't even know if waned goes far enough,
It's
completely
lapsed.
lapsed. Yeah. So I'm with you until hoop season starts back up.
Yeah,
Uh, I
that's
guess
right.
all I've got to bro out is the hat.
Yeah, hat's good. Hat's looking good. This week we are not going to a specific location as such, although we'll end up talking a lot about Ukraine. We're getting a little bit more topical, I guess. We're going to talk about drones and drone warfare and what's going on with drones because there's been some, I don't think it's too much to say, revolutionary developments in drone warfare and what it means for the present and future of conflict. And from our perspective, this is pretty important stuff because we're security studies guys. We look at bombs and bullets and wars and who's vulnerable, who's winning, who's losing, who's likely to win and lose in the future. The laboratory for this stuff has been the Ukraine war, very much. They say necessity is the mother of invention. And the Ukrainians have been and continue to be up against it in the war with Russia. And they've become geniuses of drone warfare simply because they ran out of guys, more or less. They're out of manpower. Russia continues to be able to send more and more people to the front. Ukraine can't do that anymore. So they started screwing around with off the shelf drones to fight their wars. And what has happened is they become experts and they have innovated very rapidly. And they are now apparently producing 2.5 million drones a year to fight the war in Ukraine. This has not allowed them to push the Russians out of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, the Donbass. It has allowed them to kill a ton of Russians and basically slow down the Russian advance to a crawl. It's also allowed them to do things like, what was it called? Operation Spiderweb,
Yeah.
the spectacular, multi-airfield strike inside Russia using concealed drones that nothing like that had ever been attempted before, let alone, successfully carried out. So these guys are drone warfare wizards, and everybody is paying very close attention to what's happening with the Ukrainian drone program because they're just so far ahead of everybody else. Not necessarily in terms of the latest and greatest cutting edge technology, much more in terms of operational innovation. So, how they're actually shifting the terms of drone warfare and what it means to conduct drone warfare, right, Galen? So, maybe a good place to start is to talk about the history of drone warfare. Go
Real quick,
ahead.
I this is an important topic and I give you all the credit for recommending it. And I guess if many analyses of the Pentagon right now are to be believed, I'm a little bit behind on things. So I was quite interested to read up on some of this stuff. You mentioned Ukraine's producing about 200,000 drones per month, or about 2.5 million a year. To put that in perspective, I just dug up how many drones the United States built and operated after September 11th. Very different kinds of drones, to be clear. Predator and Reaper drones that the United States was the main innovator behind at the turn of the
Mhm.
century. But nevertheless, the US built about five or 600 of those and currently operates about 300 Reapers. So we're talking about staggering numbers of these things that Ukraine is building, again, on a much different kind of scale when it comes to the nature of the weaponry itself. Uh, I was interested to read drones first extensively used during the Vietnam War.
I didn't know that.
I
And
didn't know
apparently
that,
the
or
first drone was called the lightning bug or
yeah,
something, which is another term for firefly. And they were mostly used for reconnaissance. And yeah, the idea was they got sick of our pilots getting shot down over North Vietnam and ending up in the Hanoi Hilton, right?
yes. And we should shout out, we got this from an article by Jacqueline Schneider and Julia McDonald on Foreign Affairs that did a nice
Yes.
job of laying this out. To me, the bigger rise in the importance of drones really does come after 9/11. They say in that article, I think drones flew something like 4,000 sorties in Vietnam, but weren't really a major part of the war effort. After 9/11, I think it's Dan Byman had an article in 2013, something like that, where he basically referred to them as Washington's weapon of choice.
Especially
Um,
Obama's weapon of choice, right?
Correct. Barack Obama, depending on how you look at it, either the greatest terrorist killer of all time or a major taker of innocent civilian life, depending on how you look at what are called signature strikes.
hmm
I think at the end of his term, by the way, the assessment was claimed that there were no civilian casualties in any of the drone strikes, an untenable claim.
I find
Uh,
it risible.
yeah, the claim with that was anyone who was a military age male in the vicinity of these strikes was counted as a legitimate combatant. But that's neither here nor there. But the debate at that time, and this played out again on the pages of Foreign Affairs between Audrey Kurth Cronin and Dan Byman, was sort of like, okay, there's some ethical questions involved here. Again, innocent civilians dying. And on efficacy grounds, are you creating more militants and terrorists than you're killing? Does this actually solve anything politically? On the flip side, people like Byman said, look, we have this problem of ungoverned spaces, particularly on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Unless you want the threat to metastasize or put massive numbers of American troops on the ground, which no one wanted to do, this is the best option. And being able to keep these things flying all the time puts constant pressure on groups like Al Qaeda and means that they can't communicate as easily, whether in person or via digital methods. Things look quite a bit different now. That debate looks almost like it's talking about different weaponry. So I'm curious to hear what you think the main technological innovations have been here.
Yeah. So the paradigm has completely shifted to your point. And the United States was, and I think remains, the master of the sort of like long distance standoff strike drone warfare paradigm. So these are very expensive, reusable platforms like the Reaper and Predator. They carry Hellfire missiles and they're aloft for 24 hours or however long they can stay aloft, right? These are big machines. They're basically unmanned aircraft and they're great for taking off from an isolated base in the middle of nowhere and just staying aloft and covering tons of ground, looking for vehicle convoys. And the idea was you see a vehicle convoy, you have like reasonable intelligence that there's somebody in there who's a terrorist, and you just incinerate the first vehicle in the convoy, and then the last one, everybody's trapped, and you pick them off at your leisure, right? And you just write the whole thing off as a bunch of terrorists. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Who's to say? But that was the paradigm for a very long time. So very capital intensive. These are hundreds of millions of dollars each, and they fire missiles that are like $1 million each, something like that.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly. I think the Predators cost something like $30 million a piece. Those have
Got
been
it.
retired and replaced by the Reapers. Yeah, we're talking about expensive systems.
Yeah, 8-digit systems that fire 6 to 7 digit munitions. That was the use case that we were talking about. And it just got to be more and more about precision strikes and super high tech, frankly, brittle platforms. And we were the best at that. Whoop-de-doo, that's great for controlling the Middle East and Afghanistan and so on. What's happening in Ukraine is completely different. The Ukrainians don't have any money. Critically important point. They ran out of people. and they were basically out of options. So what did they do? Ukrainian soldiers, a lot of whom were software developers, right? Because Ukraine has a bunch of engineers and software developers. And I know that because in my various work positions, I've worked with Ukrainian contracting firms. They're very talented engineers, both on the hardware and software side. These guys all got pressed into service at the front to try to save their country. And in extremis, they turned to commercially available off the shelf drones. Drones you can buy on Amazon for like $200 from Chinese firms like DJI. And originally what they were doing was they were just putting these quadcopters aloft, right? And you may have seen or heard these quadcopters in action at like public parks. You're not supposed to fly them around in neighborhoods usually, but it happens. You might hear the buzzing, right?
It
Pretty,
happens. And I guess a quick shout out. There was a South Park episode about that many years ago. And
yes.
given that that show's been getting a lot of attention lately, I guess I thought I'd flag it.
Oh yeah, they're killing it, man. Speaking of drone strikes, but yeah. So anyway, like anybody can go out and buy these things, and they've been enabled by, I think, advances in battery technology in particular. They can fly for half an hour, 45 minutes, or whatever the case may be. They're cheap, they're maneuverable. They don't go that high, right? But they don't necessarily need to for this use case. The use case started out as, well, where are the Russians trying to infiltrate across this? I think it's 800 miles of front, right? In eastern Ukraine. And like it's heavily wooded. There's a lot of cover. There's farms, there's factories, towns, so on, right? So the Ukrainians used the drones initially to figure out where they were to launch artillery towards, basically, or to assemble a defense based on where the Russians were going to try to infiltrate, right? Pretty quickly after that, they realized that they could start dropping grenades from these drones. So they rigged up like little claw arms and stuff like that they could control using remote control radio. And then they were like, why drop grenades? These things are cheap. Why not just wire them up with Semtex, plastic explosives? These drones can carry like a kilo or two of payload, right? A kilo or two of Semtex is enough to kill a squad or blow up a vehicle, whether it's like a truck or even like armored personnel carriers or artillery pieces for that matter. Pretty soon, the Russians were dealing with clouds of these things, basically lifting off, buzzing towards them, and blowing up all their people and all their equipment. Slows them down a lot, right? So the Russians responded by basically conducting what's called electronic warfare. They were jamming the signals to try to keep these drones out of the air so that they could conduct their offensive operations, because this was privileging the defense. The Ukrainians see this and they respond by attaching fiber optic cables to these drones. So this is in the last year or two what has happened. The Russians have gotten so good at jamming, they're like, okay, we're just not going to use radio waves anymore. We're actually going to use tethered munitions. So they have, in some cases, spools of like 10 miles
Yeah.
of fiber optic cable, right?
Like this stuff blew my mind. I remember reading about Sagger anti-tank missiles during the course of the research for my book because they played a big role in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. And I thought that was pretty mind-blowing. Basically, these assembled suitcases with anti-tank munitions on a joystick inside the suitcase
Yeah.
to kill tanks. I don't remember the exact range on those, but they were nowhere near as long as these fiber optic cables are, which, as you said, I think can go up to like 12 miles. And, you know, having to learn a bit about fiber optic stuff for maybe cyber operations, learning on my own, that sort of stuff. Those are supposed to be pretty fragile.
They're super fragile. They're like super lightweight. So it's like they'll get tangled up and sometimes break.
Yeah.
That happens a lot. And then you lose the drone. But on the other hand, they can't be jammed. And like we were reading in one of these articles, what operators will do now is They will actually fly the drone into a building because they don't need like line of sight anymore. They don't need radio waves to penetrate. So you could even fly these things into tunnels underground. You can fly them into buildings, and they'll just park the drone on the ground. The drone is small. It's hard to see. It's stealth. It's black until a squad comes back into the building or a vehicle drives into the building. Then it'll like basically blow up.
Yeah.
Right.
Or you can fly it into a building, and if it's a munitions cache, blow that up.
Yeah.
That to me, I guess I should say my bias on evolution of military technology always tends to be a bit skeptical about truly revolutionary developments, but I'm open-minded on this one. I guess just to put it in sort of academic theory terms, one of the major books on explaining military effectiveness in the 21st century, written by a guy named Stephen Biddle, really smart guy. The name of the book is Military Power. One of the points he makes in there is, yeah, military technology has gotten incredibly impressive, and we have precision guided munitions and all these different things. But at the end of the day, we still have basic things like concealment from terrain. Who knows how common exactly this has been, but the article you're referring to that we both read starts with a story of a Russian soldier sleeping on a platform underneath a bridge, like extremely well concealed. And one of these fiber optic drones flies up, has a camera on it, says, hey, that's a Russian soldier, and detonates and kills him.
Yeah.
That is a real change if that level of concealment no longer is as effective as it used to be.
Yeah. And the Ukrainians think about it now as the battlefield is completely transparent. That is to say, there, to your point, there is no concealment, there is no cover, and it's kind of like a video game. You see everything from the top, and the Russians have these drones too. They're doing the same thing. So it's a race to out innovate the other side as quickly as possible. As far as this paradigm goes, there's other
Yeah,
paradigms that are also important, but this paradigm is this shift in mentality from a super expensive multi-million dollar reusable weapons platform to disposable ammunition, right? Because these things are
which
actually
cost orders of magnitude less. In
correct.
The Operation Spider's Web case you brought up, I think was on June 1st, something like that. One way of thinking about it is I believe satellite photography confirmed at least 11 Russian planes destroyed. The Ukrainians claimed 40. But one cost benefit analysis I read of it was even if the Ukrainians had only destroyed a single Russian bomber, and we know that there were at least 10 more. I'm going to forget the exact figures on how much one of the Russian planes cost. I think they said $270 million, whereas the entire operation, when it comes to the equipment that was used on the Ukrainian side, amounted to about $100,000.
That's crazy. And what we're talking about here is an idea called the cost exchange ratio. And this is a very important, indeed fundamental idea when it comes to understanding why this is a revolution. The cost exchange ratio simply refers to how much did it cost me to destroy that thing, and how much did that thing cost. That thing could be a squad of soldiers. It could be a Cold War era nuclear bomber, as in the case that you're talking about. But the point is, these drones are dirt cheap. They're so cheap that they're actually cheaper than artillery shells. And the Ukrainians are using them like short range artillery shells. And the fact is that they're better than artillery shells because they have professional video gamers effectively flying them around and targeting them where they will do the most damage. And the cost exchange ratio is like a couple $100 versus maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. And when you get to that type of cost exchange ratio, where you're talking literally like 3 to 5 orders of magnitude, that's a huge deal. That's a huge asymmetry. And if you can scale that, that makes a war impossible to win for the Russians. They're going to run out of money way before the Ukrainians do. And the Ukrainians have figured this out only because they had to. They had no other choice. They were out of
Now,
people and they were out of money.
now we should say, like, the Russians will obviously adjust.
And they are. Yeah.
And in fact, just to make all this stuff is incredibly impressive and people like us nerd out on this technology, but always important to remember we're talking about human lives and really devastating events. So just yesterday, the Russians launched a major drone strike in Kyiv that killed, I think, at least 16 people.
Mm-hmm.
Was what the New York Times reported. So the Russians will retaliate. I'm sure they'll come up with some sort of defensive innovation. This is how arms races work. But I do think it's worth emphasizing just how quickly this technology has evolved and how quickly it has become an effective asymmetric weapon. I mean, the reason the United States was so far in the lead on this stuff in the years after 9/11 was that it could afford to spend a lot of money on these massive weapons platforms that we were talking about. These
Mm-hmm.
new drones are nothing like that. These are very small and they don't cost a lot of money. And they can be fitted in some cases, or at least some of the drones the Ukrainians have produced with an AI component.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, people have talked about this for years, mainly in the case of what a war over Taiwan will look like, autonomous drone swarms. But my understanding on the Operation Spider's Web was that those components were smuggled across Russian lines in cargo containers and that they were autonomous and that the way they were able to identify, or at least partially autonomous, and the way they were able to identify their targets was by they had been trained on AI on old Soviet bomber models that the Ukrainians have at a war museum.
That's amazing.
And that's how they were able to basically detect what their targets were. The Israelis, we should say, on the opening day of Operation Rising Lion, the commencement of the war against Iran over its nuclear program, which we've talked about, also used drone components that they had smuggled across Iranian borders and then reassembled. And my understanding is those drone strikes were pretty critical in eliminating Iranian air defense capabilities, which then
Mm-hmm.
gave the Israelis and the Americans command of the skies. Those are some pretty impressive and very rapid technological changes. And I don't think the world and the United States in particular have really grappled with the meaning of that, whether it's for military doctrine or national security policy more generally.
Yeah. What is to stop, let's say, the Iranians from doing the same thing within the borders of the United States? For instance, our president is one of the most recognizable people on earth. He presents a very unique visual profile, shall we say. It would be easy to train an AI system to recognize him. Consider
And
the
we
implications
should
of that.
say it wouldn't be the first time the Iranians have targeted him.
No.
And they have openly talked about threats of assassinating him in the last month. And I think the supreme leader, Khamenei, said something, death to America means death to Trump or something to that effect. That's just the tip of the iceberg, really. There's been a lot of analysis lately from people at the Pentagon saying the United States is just as vulnerable in a lot of ways to this as other countries are. And by some analyses, I'll just also shout out another piece. This is also in Foreign Affairs by Michael Horowitz, Lauren Kahn, and Joshua Schwartz, called What Drones Can and Cannot Do on the Battlefield.
Mm.
They say the United States has underinvested on these cheaper drone models by at least an order of magnitude.
Yeah. And that's what you'd expect because we haven't had to make that investment.
Yeah.
It's like we're stuck in this, frankly, this 1990s paradigm and early 2000s where we have certain missions to perform. We don't want to have any casualties. We want to substitute capital for casualties, right? That's why we have these super expensive Predator and Reaper platforms, and we're stuck in that mentality. But like the world is changing around us. That's not to say that there aren't next generation American defense contractors
Sure.
that see what's going on and they're trying to innovate, and they're trying to, in particular, innovate past and around the sort of very slow, very stodgy military industrial procurement system that where it's like the Pentagon puts out an RFP, request for proposal, and then Boeing and Lockheed bid on it. And like you might get a new weapon system 15 years later at 1,000% of the cost it was supposed to be. You've got these new defense contractors like Anduril, which is based in Southern California, Costa Mesa. The guy in charge of Anduril is this guy, Palmer Luckey. who's a brash billionaire. Speaking of bros, he goes around in Hawaiian shirts and a mullet and a soul patch. He's a real character.
Can I
Um,
just say on the basis of that, can we differentiate between some bros? I'm not trying to go Hawaiian shirt and a mullet.
yeah, fair enough. But yeah, he's a different species of bro, but he's certainly a bro. And a big pro-Trump guy from a long ways back. He was the guy who came up with the Oculus, the VR goggle system acquired by Zuckerberg and Meta. That was his first business. He sold it for a couple $1 billion. So he's a billionaire. Now he's a defense contractor at Anduril, and they're working on autonomous drone technology. So fully independent systems that can identify targets and indeed eliminate them with or without a human in a loop. They're also doing advanced sensing capabilities, and they want to disrupt the sort of current way of doing business in the United States. They want to force everything cheaper, faster, better feedback, more software, and more innovative, because Palmer Luckey sees what's happening, and he sees that the United States is getting left behind by this new paradigm. And he thinks that it has national security implications, and I think he's right.
Yeah, can I ask you? I'll try to make this preface as brief as possible before I ask the question. Another statistic that really stuck out to me was that in recent months, I'm not totally clear what in recent months means, but say 3 or 4 seems reasonable. 70% of Russian casualties have been inflicted by Ukrainian drones, which
It's insane.
I found to be utterly astonishing.
It is astonishing. And it's like, how can the Russians possibly keep that up?
I don't think they can, which is why they'll respond. But this gets to this point, whether if you go back to the very early days of the nuclear age, there were concerns about, hey, what if non-state actors can figure out a way to get this technology? What would they need to smuggle this into the country? I think Oppenheimer said something like a screwdriver. After 9/11, obviously, the US homeland suddenly felt far more exposed. This, except, well, we don't have time to go into it here. Getting your hands on fissile material is very difficult. The United States messed up on the intelligence side with 9/11, and even that was a sophisticated terrorist operation that had been planned for years and financed. Like, these drones can cost like hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, let's talk
Not
about like operationally, or I guess more concretely, what we're talking about here. We're talking about a Hezbollah operative in the Washington, D.C. area ordering drones off of Amazon, downloading open source AI models off of Hugging Face or whatever, training the drones on pictures of major political figures in the United States, acquiring intelligence about where those political figures are going to be, acquiring explosives, difficult, but not impossible. And then setting the plan in motion, right? Where these things power on, they're hiding in garbage cans or whatever. They power on, they fly up. The Secret Service is aware of drone technology, and they set up no-fly zones and dead zones and things like that. We're talking about automated, AI-powered hunter-killers. It's not going to work. Any kind of jamming technology. That's the whole point.
Well, so this is my question. We talked a little bit about this before we started recording. There are defenses that exist.
Guys with shotguns.
All right. If we're talking about the fiber optic ones, which, as you
Yeah.
said, are not susceptible to
Jamming.
electronic warfare, there's this microwave defense that can shoot lots of these things out of the sky. Obviously, the fiber optic ones are not susceptible to that. What are we talking about when it comes to defense?
So again, it boils down to that cost exchange ratio. So if you have a new weapons platform that is sub $1,000 and you're using multi-million-dollar Patriot missiles to intercept them, that's not a good cost exchange ratio at all. And this has been, in fact, is one of Israel's problems during the recent war with Iran. Iran launched a different type of drone, the Shahed drones, which are suicide drones. And by the way, this is what Russia is using to pummel Ukrainian cities into submission. So they're effectively cheaper cruise missiles, and they can blow up an entire city block. They can be produced very cheaply, whereas the interceptor missiles are actually pretty expensive and in short supply. So Israel was actually running out of interceptors. And if Iran had kept launching those things, it could have been a problem, like a real problem, right? They were running out of time.
And some of
Now,
those did get through.
they did.
They did inflict some damage.
They did indeed. I think we talked about it, like 20 to 30
Yeah.
got through and killed some people and blew some stuff up. Now, if we're talking about sub $1,000 off the shelf drones, how do you defend against those? You need a countermeasure that costs like tens of dollars. Shotgun shells. The Russians have designated like drone sweepers that just have 12 gauge shotguns. They're basically playing sporting clays or duck hunt with these drones and shooting them out of the sky. A shotgun shell is like $1 or less. For the fiber optics, there's been talk of a new type of defense that is basically fields of scissors that will like basically cut the cords, right?
It's wild.
Isn't it funny? Wild. Yeah. And then there's also directed energy systems, which are laser beams. They're pretty expensive to set up, like $100 million to buy one of these systems. But once it's bought, you can have a shot for a couple dollars.
And the advantage there is you can take out a bunch at the same time.
That's right, especially if it's AI assisted and you're hooked up to a portable power plant or a big battery or something. You might be able to kill hundreds of these things in a few minutes.
Can you tell me more about the scissor stuff?
It's crazy. It's crazy, right?
What does this look like? Is it like
I don't know.
Giant wind farms? We have giant scissor farms that like cut wires that fly across them?
Kind of. Yeah, no, I think that's the idea. It's like the next generation of tank trap, right? And you've seen those dragon's teeth things that look like giant jacks, basically. If you're playing jacks as a kid, you have those like metal multi-dimensional crosses, right? Tank traps are just that, except you drop them on the beach in Normandy. So you can't drive vehicles up very easily. The Ukrainians use those in Eastern Ukraine. They use mines and so on to stop vehicle advances. The Russians could turn around and create like an artificial forest of sharp stuff like around their position. So you can't fly in these corded drones. The cords will get cut. They'll get hung up and the drones won't know what to do. That's why the next set of innovations is in automation. You don't need a signal of any kind. The drone just knows what to do. It knows what to look for. What this means, of course, is that there's no human being in the loop. So the drone gets its instructions, go kill something important, and then it goes and does it. It might end up killing civilians. It might end up hitting other stuff that you don't want it to hit. It's a dangerous development that kind of leads us in the direction of Terminator 2 Judgment Day, frankly. It's what people are a little concerned about, these sort of like autonomous lethal systems, right? There's some ethical considerations.
Maybe we could do an entire episode on the ethical implications of all of that, which people have been now debating for kind of a while. But
yes,
I'm more curious for your thoughts on what does this do to national security doctrine, and in particular, American national security doctrine, which, as you said, has always been capital intensive, wanting to be able to fight from afar, keep casualties low in terms of giant, large, expensive weapons systems that the United States is able to finance because it's the richest country in the world. The articles that we looked at to prepare for this, Schneider and McDonald basically said needed a lot more investment in drones and technologies related to defending against them. The article I mentioned by Horowitz et al. Basically said, this is a big deal, need way more investment, but it does not make other systems obsolete. So their argument was, if you look at the recent war against Iran, drones did all the spade work against Iranian air defenses, but you still needed crewed, piloted planes, basically, to the...
How crude? F-35s.
Yeah. I guess I'm just interested, like, where does this take American military doctrine?
That's a great question. Like, it starts with the national security strategy. So what are the jobs that the American military is going to need to do? What are our security priorities? Are we going to need to invade countries in the near future? It seems like we're out of that business, more or less, right? So maybe it's not so relevant that we need to do what the Russians are trying to do, right? And figure out a way through this defensive wall of cheap drones, which we're having a lot of trouble doing.
Yeah.
Are we going to need to protect allies? This probably helps. Given everything we've read about the state of the technology and how it affects the offense defense balance, it seems to be privileging the defense right now, at least in Ukraine. So maybe that helps Taiwan against China.
Or at the very least provides an alternative method of deterrence, which is cheaper both in terms of money and human life.
Yeah, if I'm Xi Jinping and I'm looking at invading Taiwan and what that would look like, let's say the Taiwanese invest in an underwater drone program. So drones aren't just in the air, they're also on land and at sea. The Ukrainians have innovated dramatically on land and sea as well, and in particularly in underwater drones, which they've used to sink Russian ships in the Black Sea. And that's a new one, right? So let's say the Taiwanese look at that and they're like, okay, we're going to buy 1,000 cheap underwater drones and just sink the invasion fleet. And there's no countermeasures against this stuff. Like the Chinese are probably aware of this and they're looking into it, but it's all untested, right? So are they gonna try to do this in a world where something like that is possible? It increases the risks. And if the risks are increased, then it's much easier to deter them from taking the step in the first place. The Europeans, meanwhile, they're behind on defense, as we've talked about in previous episodes. They're badly behind. And now they're talking about establishing a drone wall on the eastern border of the European Union or NATO's eastern border to try
What does
to
a drone wall look like? I mean, is it what you just described with the giant automated scissor farms?
No, I think it's a little bit more like what the Ukrainians do and just putting up this wall of like disposable automated artillery, basically, and creating that transparent battlefield, that transparent border. So if the Russians try anything, if they try to infiltrate, they try any like gray zone warfare, NATO knows about it immediately. They have complete visibility over and control over the border. And it's going to be very hard to invade the Baltics. Now, can the Europeans set that up fast enough? I don't know. If the Ukrainians help them, they probably can. And I know the Ukrainians are very interested in starting to sell some of this technology abroad. They need the money. On the other hand, they also need the technology domestically. So it's a little complicated. So, yeah, back to the United States. What does the US need to do? They probably still need global strike capabilities. So, like, what implications does that have for the type of technology that they procure? Do we need the ability to assassinate individual people without generating collateral damage like we did in previous decades with these Hellfire missiles? Maybe that's part of the answer. Do we need the ability to seek out facilities that create weapons of mass destruction? Perhaps. We always need more and better intelligence.
What's interesting to me about this, and frankly, I'm not totally sure, and I doubt anyone is, what this means exactly for the future of warfare. The future of warfare is very long and very complex, and this would
Yeah.
hardly be the first, I don't know, you want to call it revolutionary or transformative development. There was concerns about when we brought air power onto the scene about, I think it was Baldwin, the British Prime Minister, the bomber will always get through. We've had strategic bombing campaigns. This could be the latest iteration. It does seem different to me. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say it's revolutionary like nuclear weapons are. But what is interesting to me is this does put traditional US military doctrine in an interesting place, which is it is a way of replacing or of obviating the need for human operators, which in theory could drive down casualties, which is consistent with US doctrine. On the other hand, the US likes to play to its strengths when it comes to building technologies that are really expensive that only it has access to and therefore it can dominate with. And these are not that.
No.
This is an asymmetric weapon, which in theory could privilege weaker actors. I think it remains to be seen. And maybe the United States will pour a ton of resources into this and come up with a new system that takes care of some of these issues. But it's an interesting way in which it puts in tension different parts of US doctrine. And I'll be curious to see how US war planners grapple with that tension.
Well, we need a war, right? Before, like, we're trying to plan for this stuff. Hegseth has announced, I think within the last week, an initiative, like it's basically like a crash program to improve US capabilities with these cheap disposable drones. So he wants like every squad to be equipped with cheap drones by like the end of 2026, which is like light speed, basically,
Yeah.
as far as defense procurement goes. I think it's unlikely to work because we're not under any operational pressure right now to actually learn how this stuff works and like why it matters. We're watching the Ukrainians do it. We're not doing it ourselves. There's a big difference there. Something you said I think was really important and interesting, which is the US really likes to play to its strengths in having lots of money and scientific expertise. So I would actually expect the US to invest a ton in hyper sophisticated counter drone.
Yeah.
So these laser weapons and automated defense systems and things like that, that's going to be a big area of innovation. And I know that Anduril is working on stuff like that too.
That's what I would think would be the smart thing to do. Like, granted, geography isn't what it used to be in an era of ICBMs, but US geography remains a major strength, and more invulnerable homeland, though increasingly vulnerable. I think looking at defensive countermeasures would be the place to start if I were actually apportioning the money.
That makes sense. And then you're like, do you have hunter killer drones that kill other drones? And what does that look like? It's like you can spin out all these like crazy
And to your
scenarios.
point on like automation, there are parallels here to other sectors of defense. So if
Mhm.
you're looking at whether you're working in a enterprise space or at the national security level, something like cybersecurity, there are people known as threat hunters whose job is to survey their networks and look for anything anomalous or that looks like a cyber threat and go after it. But now we have systems that are automated to do that. It's crazy for me to think about a world in which that's happening in physical space with
Just think about robotics and
I
like
know, but like huge numbers of drone swarms just fighting other counter drone swarms without any human interaction. Maybe we're a little ahead of ourselves, but it's less inconceivable to me than it used to be.
I think that's where we're headed. And people are wondering why AI is a like AI supremacy is a national security imperative. This is why, right? This is the theory of the case. It's like our drones need to beat their drones. Our robots need to beat their robots. Otherwise, we'll be defenseless. Got to make those investments.
Wow. I guess again, I'll say it. What a time to be alive.
What a time to be alive. And on that note, why don't you tell us about the book you've been reading?
I have been reading a book called The Folly of Realism by
Okay.
Alexander Vindman.
Where have I heard that name before?
He was one of the major witnesses in the first Trump impeachment trial back in
Right.
2019, which I have gratefully not thought about in a very long time, but um, basically involved the president holding aid to Ukraine in abeyance with the hope that President Zelensky might produce dirt.
Charisma, right?
Yeah, which Hunter Biden was involved in.
Yes, that guy.
I might not have the details exactly right, but essentially it was for partisan political purposes or personal political purposes, holding aid that had been appropriated by Congress to Ukraine in abeyance. So that's how he gained prominence.
That
Look,
seems so quaint now. That
yeah,
was
no,
only a few years ago.
I feel that way every year. Stuff that was a big deal the year before, I'm like,
Eh,
uh, yeah. Look, I have written a book. It is extremely difficult and time consuming, and anyone that does it, I have respect for. So I always like to preface when I am critical of something. That note, I was not super enthralled with the book. He basically makes the case that the problem with US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War has been that it's been driven by realism, which we've talked about on the show before, is one of the major paradigms in international relations theory. It was difficult for me to accept that, if for no other reason than most people, myself included, would not describe US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War as
that's
acting.
realistic.
What everyone thinks about realism, and I'm not going to go into the details of it here, like, it is very hard for me to be persuaded that has been what has been driving US foreign policy.
I would agree with that. Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. We've had varying forms of idealism mostly up until
and
recently.
what he calls for is what he calls neo-idealism, which
Oh boy.
was a little tough for me to wrap my head around, but essentially was saying you should act on the basis of common values and principles and ideology, which is very much how I would describe U.S. foreign policy since
Yeah.
the end of the Cold War. You know, he
That sounds like
described
neoconservatism.
that, right, which was my thought, or liberal internationalism. People like John Bolton, who was
A
an
neoconservative.
yes, major neoconservative, first as the ambassador to the UN under Bush 43, and then briefly Trump's national security advisor, like in no way could be considered a realist. I'm guessing what's going on is he objects strongly to the work of realists like John Mearsheimer, who we have talked about, who blames the
Hmm.
war purely on NATO expansion. Lumping everyone into that camp, who I would argue do not deserve to be in that camp, makes it tough for me to accept the book's overall argument. Um,
Yeah. John
that's
Mearsheimer, not an Iran hawk, for
right,
instance,
right,
in particular.
or an Iraq hawk, right? Like
Yeah.
a bunch of realists or people who identify as realists took out a full page ad in the New York Times before the Iraq War to say, "Don't do this. This is a really bad idea." It's tough to square. That said, if you're interested in learning more kind of about the history of the roots of the current war going back to the end of the Cold War, there's plenty of interesting stuff in there that will be of value.
That's cool. Do you think that part of the book is good? Part of the
Yeah,
source
I
is
think,
good?
look, if you're someone that is new to this stuff or finds this stuff is hopelessly complex, and so even having the basic storyline, yeah, I think he does a decent job of laying out like what happened, not as enthusiastic about the analysis thereof.
Got it. Fair enough. I probably won't read it. But
Fair enough, man.
I'm gonna find something to read for our next book quarter. I've been on a bit of a fiction kick. It's time to get back to nonfiction.
Okay.
Uh,
Fiction's allowed too.
yeah, fiction's good, but yeah. On this show, we talk about nerd books.
Yeah.
All right, buddy. That's drones. Till next time.
All
This
right.
has been Global Tantrum.
Good to see you, man.
Yep, likewise.